Can you all hear me? It's great to be here with kindred spirits. I've been a plant guy ever since I was a little kid, and I'm still a plant guy well into retirement. When I retired in 2001, I got interested in roses and big time, and I've spent a lot of time since then growing them, showing them, talking about them to audiences. How many of you grow roses? Great. How many of you as master gardeners have people coming to you asking questions about roses? Some do. Oh, okay, but not a lot. I think people are afraid of growing roses. They say, oh, I don't want to grow roses, they're too hard. Well, that's baloney. If you know what to do, it's easy, and they're the most rewarding of all flowers you can grow. So today I'm going to talk about why they're so popular and review a lot of the different types of roses that are available, how to grow them and care for them, and how to learn more about them. But before we begin, I'm going to have a short quiz for you. You ready for this? What's America's national flower? Hey, there we go. That was an easy one. Yeah, back in 1986, President Reagan signed a proclamation to establish the rose as America's national floral emblem. And there he is. And that lady in the picture was the president of the American Rose Society back then. Second question. What other nations have selected the rose to be their national flower? Anybody name any? England? Well, here we go. 12 or 13 countries have also selected the rose as their national flower. So we're not alone out there. Everybody loves roses. So why are roses so popular? I think there's several reasons. They're tremendously diverse in terms of size, shape, color. These are all different kinds of roses. You can see how different they are. They span every color except one. What color does not occur in roses? Blue. Good. There's never been a blue rose. They've tried to breed blue roses for years, but no luck. They've been able to produce a rose plant where the whole plant is blue, but not just the flowers. Fragrance. When you grab a flower, what's the first thing you do with it? And if there's nothing there, you think, oh gosh. Roses are really fragrant. A lot of people think just the old garden roses are fragrant, but the modern roses aren't. Well, that's baloney. There are some modern roses out there, a lot of them. This one called Double Delight, that are every bit as fragrant as the old roses. They bloom all year long in a warm climate. Can you name another woody flowering shrub that blooms all year long? The answer is no, you can't. There aren't any. That's a remarkable trait about roses, is that they bloom all the time. If you had a greenhouse, you could grow roses all year long in your greenhouse. If you lived in Southern California, you could grow roses all year long. They keep flowering and flowering and flowering. And the reason for that is that that's controlled. That trait's called remontancy, and it's controlled by one gene. And that gene was discovered in a rose growing in China called Rosa chinensis, hundreds of years ago, by Chinese gardeners. They recognized immediately how special the plant was that would bloom all the time. European botanists went over there, brought some of that stock back, bred it with the roses of the day, and created several lines of ever-blooming roses. So we're going to talk about different types of roses. Species roses, old garden roses like your grandma used to have in her yard, And then the modern roses, which are ever blooming. There's a whole range of different types. Starting with the species roses, roses are also wild plants that grow out of nature. There are roughly 150 species have been named. They're all in one genus, the genus Rosa, and in the Rosaceae family. They occur throughout the northern hemisphere, but not in the southern hemisphere. And mostly have these species roses mostly have simple flowers with 5 petals, like the Scots rose, native of Scotland and England. It's Rosa spinosissima, and you can see 5 petals. Oops, what am I doing here? This is our native species rose, which you've seen growing along the highway. Rosa nutkana, the Nootka rose, blooms in May. This is a Asian rose called Rosa glauca. Very small flowers, about as big as a quarter. And the foliage is glaucous, which means whitish, has a whitish wax on it. And what's special about these is they have beautiful red hips that hold all winter long. And these plants will get this big. I used to have one. I cut it down because it was just so big. Old garden roses are still fairly popular. We now call them heritage roses, or a lot of people do. This is kind of an interesting story. Back in 1867, a rose grower in France discovered a rose growing in his garden that looked like a hybrid tea. And nobody had ever seen a rose like this before. Hybrid teas were just accidentally found by some guy, just an accidental coincidence of pollination or something. And this rose people were so excited about this rose, they named it La France. And that marks the year at which modern roses were born and old roses were now called old roses, and that was 1867. So now we still grow lots and lots of different kinds of old garden roses. I'll show a few examples of these. This is a Gallica rose, native to Europe. This one's called Rosa Gallica, and this variety is called officinalis. This rose goes back thousands of years. It's a single-petaled rose. It's very fragrant. It's very vigorous. It was grown by the Egyptians. It was grown by the Romans, and that's known as a fact. During the War of the Roses in England, it was the motto or the symbol of the forces of Lancaster. I called it the Red Rose of Lancaster. Very beautiful, extremely historically important rose. Another very old rose is called the autumn damask rose, Rosa damascena. It's called a damask rose because it's believed to have been discovered by crusaders in Syria who brought it back to Europe. That's been questioned by people, but that seems to be the story that people like to tell. This is an interesting rose. It's called a moss rose. And if you look at the sepals, they have this mossy looking stuff growing on them. And interestingly, if you take those and you squeeze them in your finger, they smell like pine oil, of all things. And they have beautiful flowers, and they're very popular. They bloom once. This is what's known as a bourbon rose, and these are ever-blooming roses. This was used by French farmers in what was known as the Ile de Bourbon, which is now called Reunion Island. They used it as fences in their fields. And a lot of new types of these things just sort of originated by themselves. And now they're quite popular as old garden roses. Some old roses can become problematic and hard to grow. They need to be staked They also not disease resistance. I've heard people say, "Oh, go with the old roses. They're disease." No, they're not disease resistant. They did not breed for this in the old days. They bred for fragrance and color, and so a lot of these old roses, I've grown a lot of them, are very problematic from a disease standpoint. Most popular of all roses today are the modern hybrid teas. These roses are bred to produce long stems with big, beautiful flowers on the end. And that's what they usually mainly used for. And they're great for garden roses. You can cut them, bring them in, give them to your wife or husband, or give them to the neighbors, and they love them. Here are a few examples. This is called Olympiad, a beautiful red. Teneke, a nice white. I keep hitting that darn Marilyn Monroe, an amber colored rose. This one you can see has a perfect high pointed center. If you want to enter a rose in a rose show and win, you have to have a rose like that to even have a chance. This is a great German rose that I've got in my garden. It's called Alina. Tall, beautiful bush. Another type of roses that are kind of like hybrid teas are called grandiflora roses. And it's kind of an artificial designation. These roses sort of emerged as a sort of a hybrid tea called Queen Elizabeth, but it didn't fit it into any categories. So they created a category called what did I just say? Floribund or grandiflora roses. And here are some examples. They're generally grouped in with the hybrid teas, but they are a little different. This is called Waiheke. This is an interesting story on this rose. It was bred by an Irishman named Sam McGreedy, who moved to New Zealand and became a very popular, important rose breeder. And he bred this rose and called it Waiheke, named it for an island offshore of northern New Zealand. They brought it into the United States and nobody bought it. And then they changed the name to Waikiki. Boom, up go the sales. Packaging is everything in flowers. Tournament of Roses, kind of off-red, nice form, really pretty hybrid tea rose. Florimunda roses are just the opposite. They're bred to produce sprays, not individual flowers, but beautiful sprays of flowers. And they tend to be smaller. The bushes tend to be shorter and compact. Here are a few examples. This is called Escapade. This is a sparsely petaled rose. Some of these are fairly sparsely petaled, others aren't. Playboy, this one is a beauty. It's really that bright in nature. It's one of the brightest roses I know of in terms of color. Colorific, this just came out a few years ago, and it's fantastic. Look at the colors in there. And they come up in these big, beautiful sprays. Shrubs and climbers. There's a lot of different kinds of shrubs and climbers. They tend to be long stemmed and rangy. This is one called watercolors. This one is called Sperry's Hoop. That's the name of the town of the rose hybridizer who bred this rose, northern Germany. My wife and I have, Handel is the next one. My wife and I have a deck in back of our house with a railing, and we have Handel and Sperry's Hoop growing together. That's Handel on the far right and Sperry's Hoop. And they bloom all summer like this. It's just a joy to watch these things. And a very popular type of roses that's grown today are called minis. The plants can be big, but the blossoms are very small, and they're easy to grow. They're tough as nails, and there are all kinds of minis available. Every year they're coming out with more minis because they're easy to breed. And they make nice little container plants. We have them growing around on our porch and stuff. So that gives you sort of a flavor of what's out there in the world of roses. Now let's talk about how you grow them and care for them. And this is where people have problems. So when do you do this? How do you do that? So I'm going to try to organize this into planting, watering, fertilizing, all that stuff, pest control, and can you grow roses organically? That question always comes up, especially with people like you folks. You want to grow, you don't want to use chemicals. Can we grow roses without using chemicals? So I'll talk about that. February and March is when you go out to the nursery and you buy your roses and you plant them. But I highly recommend you buy your roses from a nursery where you can lift the plant up out of the sawdust or whatever and look at the roots. If the root systems are not good, do not buy the rose. These, of course, are grafted plants. The root systems, the rootstock are rooted cuttings, so they have nice umbrella-like root systems on them. And then that wide place in the stem is where they bud graft the cultivar. So the one on the left looks like a pretty good buy to me. It's got a lot of nice canes and an even root system. The one on the right doesn't look so good. The root system swept in one direction. So you can do better than that. You're going to pay 25, 30 bucks for a rose plant. You don't want to buy one that's not number one, okay? You want to get them planted before the end of March. That's really important. They're easy to plant. Hopefully you have a halfway decent soil. If you have a hard pan, you've got a problem with roses. They don't like soggy soil. But you dig a hole a little bigger than the root system, mound the soil up in the middle, and then take that plant and plop it down on that mound, pack the soil in around it, water it in, and then I recommend mulching it for about a month to give the roots a chance to get established before the leaves come out. As soon as the leaves come out, they're going to start transpiring and losing a lot of water. And you want to have a decent root system there before that happens. You also want to prune existing roses in March, early spring. That's a question that always comes up. When do I prune my roses? In the spring, March. In the fall, October. I'll go over that later. The objectives of spring pruning are to keep the plants juvenile. You don't want your plants to get woody and big and gross. You want to keep them low and juvenile. You want the shoots to come out from low on the ground to produce nice, vigorous, young, flowering canes. You remove all the dead, diseased or whatever canes. And you select 3 or 4, quote, good canes. A good cane is a cane that originates way low on the graft, is not a dog leg, is not growing up through the middle. And so here's an example. This is a bush that I've just unmounded and I'm ready to prune it. And those red tabs or lines are canes that I removed. The one on the left, I removed it because it's a weak cane that's growing in towards the center of the plant. The next one is a dog leg. It has an old stem under it that's coming off of that. And then there are 2 really nice ones in the middle, but you don't want 2 canes growing right next to each other. So I took one of those out. And so that one and the other 2 on the right are the ones I kept. And then, this is going to be shocking to a lot of you, is you prune those down low to an outside bud. And when I say low, that's what I'm talking about. People don't do this. And one mistake that everybody makes in roses is they are bashful about pruning them. You want them low, 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 low. So that's what it should look like. Can you hold your questions to the end? I can't hear very well, and Mary is going to help me do that. So write that down. Now watch this. This is March. This is April, same garden. You can see again a little bit of red coming out on there from the new shoots coming out. That's April. That's May. And that's June. And remember what they look like in March. Do you believe me now? Prune low in the spring. Prune low.
Spring, you said?
Say again?
Prune in the spring?
This is your spring pruning. March, yes. Come on. This is what you don't want to end up with. You see this everywhere. This is because people they don't prune low enough. So they end up with all these woody lower stuff, and the new shoots are coming up way up off the top. You don't want that to happen. The way you keep that from happening is by pruning super low in the spring. That shocks everybody. It does. But believe me, I've been doing this for 40 years, and it worked. It worked every year in 40. So where we go? Fertilizing. How do you fertilize roses? You begin when the soil temperature is about 55. I just have a little soil thermometer I stick down in the ground. When in the rooting zone, 55, that's usually May. And the reason you do that is that the roots don't really start growing until the soil gets up to, this is Celsius, about 25. 55 is about 13. If you get them in at about 55, they're right at the beginning of the season where the roots are just going to explode. You put fertilizer on the ground when the roots aren't growing, they're not going to pick it up. You want the roots growing the same time the fertilizer is going down in the ground. And that's why the timing is important. Depending on your soil test, if you got one, I recommend you do that. You're mainly interested in nitrogen because the nitrogen leaches out of the soil every winter and you need to replenish that right away. So you want nitrogen, P and K plus micros. So here's what I use. This is a Puyallup Rose Society mix that I buy from the Tacoma Rose Society at a good price. And it's got two types of nitrogen, 10, 10, 10 on the nitrogen, NP and K, and then it's got several micros in there. There are times when you don't really need to add much P or K because it tends to stay in the soil, but you do need to add nitrogen. And another tip would be add both the ammonia type nitrogen that dissolves immediately and some sort of a slow release organic nitrogen that stays in there for a long time. So you maintain a high nitrogen level in the soil. After that first shot is gone, you still got it out there. Nitrogen is the key nutrient for plants. Fertilize in May. That's when the soil is going to be about 55. And then again in July, which would be kind of at the end of the second bloom cycle, in the middle of the second bloom cycle. You don't want to fertilize after July. And the reason for that is it will stimulate these canes to come out of the base and start to grow. Those are called basal sprouts or basal shoots. And they will not have time to cold harden before winter. So you don't want a lot of this going on in late summer, and nitrogen stimulates that. So I don't recommend fertilizing after July. And of course, lime every fall. Monitor your pH. 6.5 to 7 is where you want to be for roses. And that's around here, that's kind of hard to maintain because the pH wants to go down all the time. And so you want to keep it going up. Watering. I have people come and look at my roses in my yard and they say, "Oh my God, these are beautiful. What kind of fertilizer do you use?" And I say, water. Water is what you fertilize them with in the summer. I water twice a week, deeply. In other words, I want the soil to get wet and then dry, wet and then dry. So you're going to have to play around with this yourself based on the kind of soil you have. But for me, I have a fairly sandy soil. I can wet that soil up really well, and 3 or 4 days it's dry again, and then I do it again. That's something that you got to figure out for yourself. But you don't want to water. You don't want to water all the time and have the soil always waterlogged. Roses don't like that. And you want to avoid overhead rosing because it promotes disease, leaf diseases. So I have a couple different kinds of watering systems. This is just a pipe on the top of the ground with a little irrigation head that sprays water out like that across the top of the soil. I like that because no spider mites will attack your plants. They come out of the ground and they don't like water. And I also use drippers. You can see a little individual. Each plant has its own little dripper that comes out of the header. And do yourself a favor and buy a timer for your watering system. Deadheading. Deadheading means cutting off the spent blooms. And in the summertime, roses are going to be blooming and blooming and blooming. You have spent blooms all over the place. I'd say once a week I do it almost at home. Almost every day I walk around my garden and I'm just, my pruners and I snip stuff off. You also want to remove what are known as blind shoots. These are shoots. Let's see if I can use this pointer. Do this without advancing the slide. Yeah. At the tip of the shoot, there's no bud. You see a lot of these in the spring. Why that happens isn't really well known, but that needs to come out. That will never form a bud. It'll just grow and there will be any flowers on it. So you want to take those out too. And when you're doing this, you want to cut back on the stem to a leaflet or to a leaf that has 5 or more leaflets on it, because they are healthy, vigorous, and they will have a really nice bud just beneath that. And that bud, within 2 or 3 weeks, you can see where I cut that off and the bud come out. They already have flower buds on them. So you want to keep plants just cranking out flowers, and that's how you do it. Deadheading to healthy leaves. The next big pruning day is in the fall. Some people don't prune in the fall, but I really recommend it because if your plant is going to sit out there all winter with leaves on it, it looks awful. The wind's going to blow it down, and those leaves contain spores and insect eggs that are right there next spring to jump all over your plants. Plus, it's a lot more fun to do this in October when it's warm and sunny out than to do it in March. So that's why I recommend fall pruning. We just generally cut them back. This is not rocket science. cut them back to about this far, and you can mound your bushes if you wish. And I'm going to talk about this later. I don't think you really need to anymore. But if you want to mound your bushes up with beauty bark, that'll definitely protect them in this climate from winter, like we have out here now. Thank God it stopped. Pests. Big issue with roses is pests. The main diseases we have are black spot. You can recognize this very quickly. The spots are roundish and they have kind of feathery edges. And very soon the tissues around these spots will become necrotic or yellow. The chlorophyll dies. And if left to its own desires, it can defoliate a rose bush, and you just don't want that to happen. The next one is powdery mildew, and this is a disease of the fall and of the young foliage. And it looks like this. It starts out with a leaf curling, and then you see this whitish stuff growing on that. That's the fungus. And you just want to get rid of that because those will produce spores, and those spores will inoculate the rest of the garden with this disease. So get them out of there. The worst disease is this ugly, ugly disease called crown gall. This is a bacteria that lives in the soil, and it enters the rose plant through cuts or cracks or something in the bark. The bacteria gets into the rose plant, it takes over, it injects its own DNA into the cells of the plant. And that DNA codes for the production of those galls. It's highly contagious. It wipes out the plant, and it'll spread through pruning. If you prune this stuff off and then prune another plant, you may end up, with that. You can see where the pruning cut was made. You can see where the disease was transmitted to the plant. So you have a problem here. And really, the only thing you can do, well, the first thing you can do is to, if you've got it anywhere in your yard, you need to sterilize your pruners with every bush, or you're going to spread it. And Clorox, 10% Clorox, apply it on your pruners. The cheapest, best way to do it. But you got to clean your pruners off afterwards carefully, because that Clorox will rot the metal on your pruners. It won't rot the blades if they're stainless steel, but the springs and the bolts and things like that. Or you get rid of the plant. And I've had so many times when I have a beautiful plant in my yard. I love this plant. I've had it for 20 years. It's like a child to me, you know. And here, one year, you get this crown gall all over it. And it's just agonizing to take that plant and throw it away. It really is. But you're protecting the other plants by doing that. So it's really kind of a no-brainer. Now, can I grow roses without chemicals? And the answer is yes, to some extent you can, and you can be fairly successful. Here's some things you can do. You can choose varieties that are less susceptible to diseases. The problem with that is it may not be susceptible to, say, powdery mildew, but it is susceptible to black spot. So you play that game. But you can go to a nursery that carries roses, and you can ask the people there, what are the most disease-resistant roses you can sell me? And they know that. Another thing, this has to do with spacing of your plants. If you have your plants all jammed together, they tend to get more disease, more infection than if they're spread out. And I think that's because the spores when they're trapped in these little air pockets, don't go very far. They just move around in the plants. If the plants are separated, wind currents in your garden will blow the spores out of there. I think that's a really important thing to remember when you're planting a new garden. Don't put them too far or too close together. This is an example of this. This is a rose garden that I helped take care of in Olympia. I'll talk about this later, but you can see how wide those walkways are and how far apart those bushes are. Practice, just go to old-fashioned garden sanitation. Get the weeds out of there. A lot of these diseases or bugs will be on the weeds, and then they jump up under the root. Get the weeds out of there. And get the diseased leaves and canes. As soon as you see them, get them out of there. Throw them away. Here's something I just have become aware of not too long ago, well, within the last 10 years, I guess, is it seems like when I put new mulch on my rose garden, for 2 or 3 years, I have no bugs or diseases. And I think it's because a lot of that stuff is in the ground. The bug eggs and the fungal spores are already in the ground. But if you lay an inch of new mulch on it, they can't get through that. And this really works. Now, it's pricey. It costs a lot of money to do this every 3 years, but it'll really pay off in controlling both insects and diseases. Most insect pests, and we thank God we don't have many here, they could just be pulled off and thrown away. Thank God we don't live in back east where I grew up, where Japanese beetles rule the roost. And people just give up on roses because the beetles just eat them alive. We don't have much of that yet, although they have been reported in eastern Washington, I understand. And the U.S. or the Washington Department of Agriculture are aggressively trying to eradicate them. And bottom line, you're going to get some bugs and some diseases if you don't spray. Just put up with it. If you're a hardcore rose exhibitor and you want to go to the show with a perfect rose and perfect foliage, don't become an organic gardener. at least not with your roses. All right, where are we here? Oops. Oh, here we go. The worst rose pest in the world is deer. Let me just show you some pictures here. These were some roses we had in our yard a few years ago. We went on a vacation for 1 week, came back, and so one deer got in there and just wiped out the whole thing. Oh, they're terrible. So the only real long-term solution is to put a fence around your roses. You can see mine. It's 6 feet high, chain link. The deer can't get through it. And if you put a black fence in, it's not visible. Don't go with a shiny fence or a green fence. You can see it a mile away. Black blends in really well. Repellents, if used properly, can be effective. The secret to doing that is to spray the plants before the roses or before the deer find them. Once deer found your roses, they'll keep coming back and repellents are looking for. But if you get out there early and start spraying the leaves when they're like that, maybe every 2 or 3 weeks, I've been able to keep deer out of my roses that are unprotected all summer doing that. But you don't want to slip up and forget one time. And by the way, rabbits can be hell on roses. And we are right in the middle of a 20-year rabbit epidemic now. And in the winter, they'll eat the bark off the shoots. In the summer, I've seen them pull the canes down and then just eat all the leaves off the canes and just destroy rose bushes. Rabbits do that. So Charlie, we out in the Centennial Garden, where we'll talk about here in a minute. Last summer, we have a chain link fence around there. We bought 2 foot high rabbit fencing, which is about like that, put it all the way around. Rabbits can go through a chain link fence. I've seen rabbits running and going like this and going right through a chain link fence. Yeah, no kidding. They're amazing. A hungry rabbit can perform miracles. Now I was asked to make some comments about climate change. Hot topic politically, And so I struggle with this. What am I going to say? And so what I did is I went online and back into the NOAA website, and you can create temperature graphs. It's called Climate at a Glance. You can pick the county, the state, time period, month, whatever, and produce a graph of that. And I thought, well, maybe that's a good place to start. So I did that. And here's the graph for Mason County, Washington. This is the average temperature for the last 25 years. And so you can see there, then that green line is the mean for that particular year. And you can see that in the last 25 years, the temperature has gone up about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about, what is that? Well, 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit is going to go up over the next 25 years. That's what happened in the last 25 years. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen for other 25 years. Nobody knows what's going to happen. But as a place to start, that makes sense, right? What did it do the last 25 years? Maybe it'll do the same thing. And so let's say that happens. So what can we expect from that? The bad news is it's pretty well known that bugs multiply in warm times. And so we may see more bugs out there. And the diseases, plant diseases, also tend to increase with warm weather. So we might see some more powdery mildew or black spots out there. So if you do not want to use chemicals in your yard to control these things, this could be an issue. This could be a serious issue. We're probably going to see some increased heat and light damage to plants. This is from my own yard 2 years ago. We had a really hot spell. It bleached, the sun bleached the colors right out of my roses. It ruined a lot of really nice roses. So if it gets hotter and sunnier, we're probably going to see more of that. We're also going to need to pay attention to irrigation, because when it gets warm, the leaves get hot. Plants cool themselves through transpiration. Water evaporating off the leaves. Try it. Lick your hand, blow on it. It cools. That's how plants cool their leaves. And they have to have water in the soil to do that. The soil dries out, stomata close, no transpiration. So that's going to have implications on your watering schedule. As it gets warmer, you're going to have to pay attention to make sure that you're giving them enough water so they can transpire and stay cool. We're going to see more weed growth. Weeds like hot weather, just like any other plant. So I don't think that's a problem. I just go out there and pull them. But if you have a big rose garden or a regular kind of garden, you're probably going to have more weeds as the climate warms up. There is some good news. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. There we go. Roses grow faster. All plants grow faster as it gets warmer and as the CO2 increases. There are any number of studies out there that show you add a CO2 to the atmosphere, plants grow faster. That makes sense because CO2 is the primary raw material for photosynthesis, right? Give them more raw material, more photosynthesis, faster growth. There have been studies done, a lot of studies that showed that if you add another 300 parts per million of CO2 to the atmosphere, roses grow about 25% faster than they did without that. So it's a big difference. So we're probably going to get a lot better growth out of our roses on all of our plants as the CO2 goes up and the temperature goes up. And if increased temperature is going to increase destructive insects, it's probably also going to increase beneficial insects. So we're going to see maybe more pollinators out there. We might see more predatory insects that are eating the bad guys. We're certainly going to have longer growing seasons. So they're going to start blooming and growing earlier and shut down later. And we'll have warmer winters. In fact, that's already been shown to happen, that places where the temperature is rising fast, most of that temperature rise is occurring in the winter, not the summer. So that's kind of good news. And a big deal, for me at least, is we don't have to worry about cold damage as much. So I was growing roses back in the 1980s, and in 1986, we had an event here that was extraordinary. It got down into the low teens, near 10 degrees for several nights in a row. And it wiped out everybody's roses, and it wiped out all the roses at all the nurseries in the area. Nobody had any roses for another 2 years. It was disastrous. The likelihood of that happening, or things like that happening, as the temperature goes up, are reduced. So those are the things that jumped into my head. There are probably other things you can have. And this is really complicated. These are one factor effects. You know, you have an increase in destructive index, you're going to have an increase in pollinators, or you're going to have an increase in, and maybe if it gets really cold, and that'll kill some kind of bugs, but it won't kill other bugs, and these bugs prey on this kind of bug, and these flowers. It's really complicated when you get down to it. So these are just some first order thoughts that kind of popped into my head. Now, how do you learn more about roses? If you're interested, one thing you can do is you can join the American Rose Society, rose.org. Hard to forget that. Rose.org. They produce this magazine 5 times a year. It's a beautiful magazine. It really is. I have some of them up here on the table that you can take home if you want. These are back issues. I invite you to do that. Unfortunately, we don't have a Rose Society anymore in Olympia. It went belly up during COVID, and I don't think Shelton has one. But Seattle, Tacoma, and Puyallup have very active Rose Societies that have excellent websites. You could go there and learn about it. They tell you when the rose shows are going to be. Tacoma has a terrific rose show every year. Go up there and look at it. You will walk out inspired, I promise you. Another thing you can do, this is a little advertisement here, if I may. I belong to a group called Friends of the Centennial Rose Garden, and one of our fellow members is Charlie back there. He's a member of our group. This is about half a dozen people, holdovers from the old Olympia Rose Society, and about 5 or 6 volunteers who are master gardeners. And we take care of this rose garden using all the things I talked about in terms of pruning and all that stuff. You can learn more about this by going to the Olympia Tumwater Foundation. Just go to that. I'll leave that up for a minute if you want to take a picture there. Go to that website and you can learn about more of it. Or you can read my book. It's called The Rose Doctor. It's on Amazon. And this book, I wrote this book with master gardeners in mind. Because you could take this book and somebody comes to you and says, what's the matter with these leaves on my rose bush? And you can go through a key on here and key it out. You know what a key is? It's like a decision tree, answer questions. And it'll take you to a page that has a picture of the problem and a description of it. So I'll leave this up here on the table. This is on Amazon, just the Rose Doctor. And I'll look at my monthly report and see if I get an uptick in sales. That's all I have to say. Before we do the quick Q&A, I have terrible hearing. I was a tank commander in the Army, and that didn't do my ears any good. This ear is totally dead. This ear is on life support. So Mary has asked a question to Mary, and then she will ask me. You had one right off the bat, right?
So my question is back to the pruning. And yes, I'm always afraid to prune too low. I think one time I pruned too low and I pruned it below the graft.
Oh, that's not good.
So the rootstock started, or I ended up with a
So
bush.
part of that pruning low is to prune above a bud. You want to make sure there's at least one bud still on that stem, and it should be facing outward. That way the branch won't grow in, it'll grow out.
Dale, what do you propose for a good rose to put in a container? So the question is, what do you propose for a good rose that would go into a container?
I've seen people grow just about any kind of a rose you can imagine in containers. But the problem with containers is that in the wintertime, the soil can freeze and kill the plant. So you have to be able to either move the container indoors, roll it in under the deck or something, or if you have smaller containers, maybe like this size, you can bury them in bark dust or beauty bark. And I have friends in Tacoma who do that very successfully. They have a hard clay soil and they grow their roses in containers that are about that big, and then they bring in a pickup load of beauty bark, put it low, and then in the spring they rake the bark out. That works really well. But any kind of rose will grow in the container. I would suggest a Floribunda rose, which are fairly small and have lots of flowers on them. You can do hybrid teas, but you're going to end up with a plant that's really tall and maybe 3 or 4 blossoms. The Floribundas really work well in containers.
Okay, I think I've given myself 2 serious problems.
Don't blame me. No, I'm just a messenger.
Okay, I have about 30 plus roses scattered around my property.
Okay.
They are all now sprouting from below the ground.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't make any difference whether they are Weeks roses, Jackson Perkins roses, whatever, but they have, over the years, I'm getting that universal red rose fruit.
Yeah, that's called Dr. Huey. That's a rootstock. It's called Dr. Huey.
So I just keep pruning those off, picking those off.
Well, are you still getting the cultivar 2 coming up?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, just keep cutting them off. Or you pull them off. If you can pull them right out, it's better than cutting them off.
So what did I do to get all that rootstock to sprout?
Well, what happens is when a rose bush, let me back up a second. Rootstocks are bred to be highly vigorous. So you might have a rose bush that's losing vigor for whatever reason. And that rootstock will say, aha, and they'll start throwing out stuff. I don't know there's any one variety more than another. I think it just has to do with how vigorous the plant is. The more vigorous the plant is, it suppresses the rootstock from throwing out shoots.
So the red roses in my Cecil Bruner,
No,
they bloom a little later, just as the pink Cecils are sort of dying back. It's pretty and it's a 30-foot bush. But anyway, I've now got black spot everywhere. Can I dormant spray? Because my
That'll help.
spray isn't working for 30 different roses around the yard.
okay, I can tell you what to do, but if you don't, you can put your, if you, or like, Don't listen to what I'm saying. What I do is in spring, as soon as the shoots are maybe that long, I spray them with a fungicide, maybe early and then again in 2 weeks. And that'll control the spring diseases, which is black spot and downy mildew, which is a lethal disease. It'll take care of that. And generally, I don't see much more later on in the year. If you can nip it off in the bud real early with just a regular fungicide, you need to alternate every year and use a different one. That will solve, I think, a real long way to solving that problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ginny? So the question, is there a difference between pruning a climbing rose versus a bush rose?
Good question. And the answer is yes, there is. Do you grow raspberries? Anybody grow raspberries? And if you leave the raspberry plant, you just go straight up, you get berries on the top. If you lay it down on a wire, you get raspberries coming up all along the shape. It's the same way with roses. If you have a long rose cane, put it on a trellis or on a deck railing like I showed you in that picture, and every bud that comes out on that cane will grow and will produce flowers. That's how you prune climbers. But you have to have a long cane rose, and you have to have a place to lay it down, like a fence or a trellis.
And then you just prune it back to that?
That's a good question too. It's a little tricky because you're going to have big shoots coming out of that cane. You know, these guys. So what I try to do, find those guys and I lay them down, and I'll lay another ones down. The ones that still have unopened buds, just keep laying them down. Just as long as the top bud is below the other buds. The top bud on any plant produces hormones that impedes the development of buds below it. So if you can put that top bud lower than the other buds, then they will all break. And that's the secret to growing climbers.
That's interesting. I guess there's time for one more question, if there's one more question. Oh, we have some questions on our Zoom. Go ahead.
Oh,
Okay, the first one is, can that rose be saved? We cut all the way over, part of it turns real woody. Can
I'm-
that be saved?
I'm sorry, what was the
If the
question?
rose is not pruned correctly in the spring, and it turns woody down the road,
Yeah.
can it be saved?
Well, what I'd recommend there is try it on one of those branches. Cut one of the old ones off and see what happens. If it just dies, maybe too late. But if it'll form little shoots below it, then there's a chance maybe you can do all of them that way. Instead of just doing the whole bush, do part of the bush and see what happens.
And we have one more. May I do one more? Okay, can you dig up a rose plant and replant it in another area?
Yes,
So that was a question. I don't know if our audience heard. Can you dig up a rose plant and replant it in a different area?
yes, do it when the plant's not actively growing. Roses don't go dormant, but in the winter they're inactive and the roots aren't growing. So do it when it's cold out, like now would be a good time, or early spring or late fall. But you can do that. Yeah, you can move them around. Yep, sure can.
Okay, one last one.
Okay, so right now, all of our roses are budding out, but this is the time
Yeah.
to nip transplant and whatnot. What do we do? Just not, or?
Well, remember that picture I spring pruned right back down to the ground? That's what you do.
Okay.
Those little things, this is a good question. Those little buds that are starting to come out now,
Yeah.
they're probably going to be damaged by cold weather. We got January ahead of us. And if you let those grow next spring, there's a good chance there'll be blind shoots or they'll be damaged. So start from scratch, cut all that stuff off, and let the brand new buds that haven't started to grow yet, let them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.